So I'm here with Richard Cox, a new friend of mine. You and I have been talking quite a lot, but I don't have a very clear sense of your sort of timeline with non-dual spirituality. And I'm hoping that today we can go through that more to get a better understanding of the trajectory of your very nuanced journey that's led to a lot of really valuable insights into the, let's say, promises and pitfalls of uh, modern non-dual spirituality. So I think I'll just like jump right in and just ask you, how did you discover quote unquote non-dual spirituality, and what drew you to it? Start at the beginning.
Yeah, the older I get, the longer this story gets, and the further back in time it was too. So it's getting harder to tell. But I suppose as a child, I had philosophical inclinations and interests. So when the internet became a thing, and we got it in the house first when I was about 15, right, I used it to download René Descartes' meditations
Mm,
because I wanted to know about the nature of the self and truth and these kind of things. And that seemed like important to ask these foundational questions about life. It's probably a little bit atypical for
mm,
a 15-year-old, okay,
yeah,
into these metaphysical things. And Descartes kind of provided a bit of a philosophical foundation I could be somewhat happy with. I think, therefore I am. Okay, I know I exist. That's good. Got that box ticked. We can move on. At the same time, when I was 16, I started sneaking into the local pub and drinking. Mostly was a part of the Scout Association, because that's what the Boy Scouts did here in the 90s. And I had a funny experience, right, of drinking whiskey and it having a strong effect on me the next day, which I would have this incredible experience where my normal, slightly crap teenager existence would go away, and I'd
mm,
be in this wonderland of being immersed in the beauty of nature and the expansive blueness of the sky, and this
mm,
deeper sense that life just went on beyond this world, and whatever in here, it's a tiny little fragment of what really is. And I would
mm,
spend the days walking barefoot in the garden, just feeling the bark of the tree in my hand, and just being absolutely amazed and feeling like even if the worst thing I could imagine happened, like my house burned down and my family died, that'd be awful, but there'd be an okayness to it. There was an okayness underpinning life. And the next day I'd wake up and that would all be gone. And what on earth just happened? I go out and put my hand on the tree again. And what was I so excited about? It's just a tree. It's this, I was lifted into a kind of nirvana state and then slapped back into samsara. And
yeah.
these experiences happened repeatedly. I don't know why they happened to me under the spell of whiskey, right? It was
Mm,
akin to a mushroom experience, a psilocybin experience. And as I've done that later, there's a comparison there, not as kind of hallucinogenic, or not as kind of animist in nature, but as similar in the sense that life takes on this deep kind of meaning, and you just know that whatever you know is a tiny, tiny little fragment of what is, and it
mm,
seems to be really good, right? So these experiences just sat in the background for me because I didn't know how to relate them to anything else in life. I'd never heard of this happening. I
yeah.
didn't know if I was literally the only person in the world it had ever happened to, because why wasn't everyone talking about this? It seemed like the most amazing thing in life. And
Yeah.
I could only relate it to the likes of, some poem by William Blake, something about seeing eternity in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower. And I think, okay, that sounds maybe Blake had it, right? That's because we did it in English. I never thought about him that way, but I just didn't know what to make of it. But I also knew that this was the most important thing in life. Okay.
Mm,
And even if I kind of forgot about this experience of periods or I wasn't thinking about it, this was still
mm,
there's a way to kind of know that life is full of meaning and beauty and wonder. And it seems like it goes on after death. I kind of get that sense too. So that was me wondering how to recapture that and wondering, well, I don't know, like whiskey's a drug, right? So maybe if I take other drugs, that will compel me back there. And
mm,
then somehow I was kind of drawn to spirituality, and I've got, okay, yeah, there's this thing called meditation, right? And I don't know what that is, but it's
mhm,
about changing consciousness, and my
yeah.
consciousness changed. So maybe that's a place to look. And that led me down a road then of getting involved in Eastern martial arts, because that seemed a bit more of an empirical way of doing it. I'm not sure I'd say that was true now, but it seemed so at the time, like something that's kind of real and has a kind of gateway into that. And that led me into getting into meditation, and attempts to understand that, and getting very much into Zen. And in Zen, I found this sense of this talk of being in the present moment, in both mindfulness and Zen. And I thought, yeah, hey, that's resonant. Like I didn't think of it that way, but in these experiences, I was in the present
Mm.
moment. You know, I wasn't worried about all the things that had gone wrong yesterday, and I wasn't projecting disasters into the future. I was there. So that kind of opened the gateway to me thinking maybe there's something in this. And that's the first step, Jessica, right? So maybe I'll just pause there for a second and see if you have anything you want to ask about that, and well, then I can proceed on with how it all
Thank
went wrong.
Yeah, thank you for giving me that pause. I guess I wanted to ask if you're open to sharing, what would you like as a teenager? You mentioned something about like this craft life. Would you say that you were a depressed teenager or that you were, 'cause it sounds like you were with that philosophical inquiry that there was a consideration of what's the truth, the bigger truth of
Yeah,
reality. You know
I
that,
would say averagely miserable. Okay, so I was born into a kind of Christian culture, not a strongly Christian culture, but it's sort of British cultural Christianity, if you like, where there's a God, he's big and all loving and good, and he made this world so we could all have fun and worship him, and it all seemed very nice. Okay, and this kind of belief system uh, fell away to the cold hard realities of the world and the cold hard realities of science, where I was left in a more sort of materialist, reductionist um, space in life. Okay, throughout my teenage years, and that seemed like wonderful for a while, but then, and I know I'm just saying trite things that everyone on spiritual podcasts who goes through this journey says, right? But the emptiness of materialism
yeah,
rose up to bite me. Oh my God, well, we're all just piles of atoms talking to each other. What is free will, and why does it matter if someone has a loving experience in life or is tortured to death? It's just a pile of atoms. It was sort of comparable to the nondual, really, Jessica, of saying like there are no selves really.
yeah,
There's no me and there's no you. There's just atoms interacting. So who cares? Like the atoms in me are no different to the atoms in a plastic cup, you know. So they probably are a bit different technically, but you know what I mean. So that was a kind of metaphysical angst and a kind of metaphysical misery that took over me. And then I probably had, I would say, fairly average like teenage misery of like being an awkward teenager, not being very socially graceful, not being good with girls, that kind of thing, being kind of miserable at school and feeling
yeah.
it was all a bit of an empty experience. So I wouldn't say I was like a ridiculously miserable teenager. I was just averagely miserable, but I had a kind of metaphysical angst on top of it.
Yeah, I was gonna say like a certain type of like teenage angst, existential angst. And I asked you just because I mean I think it's relatively clear that people tend to go towards not just non-dual spirituality, but spirituality in general, where the sort of assumption or like the tagline is kind of like the truth that will set you free. But what I tend to find is there's people that are just sort of like I don't know if you're pronouncing this right, like cosmonauts, and then people that are just like philosophically intrigued and want to understand the truth of reality. And then there's people who are literally just hearing a message of this is something that can, radically save you from suffering. And of course, there's overlap. A lot of people, it's both. But was just trying to
Mm.
get a sense of for you, if it was truth as well as freedom from suffering that both attracted you about it
Yeah, I
was.
mean that's a good. I would definitely say it's an overlapping thing. I think I tend to emphasize the metaphysical more strongly because it seems
Yeah.
important to me. But I think
Mhm.
the metaphysical seem like an essential foundation that if you're really going to enjoy life, and because I think what I really value in life is, oh, this sounds trite, but love and human relationships. Okay,
Sure.
um, but to me it seems like, well, if you don't have like a solid metaphysical understanding of what life is, then how are you gonna get that? And that's
Yeah.
something I've had to actually challenge within myself when talking with other people about this stuff, that not everyone, in spite of my assumptions, actually has that desire for metaphysics. Most people are quite happy to assume a certain goodness to the world or feel a certain goodness without the same kind of
Yeah.
philosophical grounding.
Right. So you were kind of looking for the package deal.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm. And I completely relate to that. So if you want to go back to, you were saying we got to the point where you were saying, and then things kind of went wrong or downhill or.
Yeah. So I definitely saw a link between what was being said in spirituality and my experience. But
Mhm.
I was very cautious about that initially. So I bought a book on meditation and the whole mindfulness thing.
Mhm.
Whilst, as I mentioned, I could relate to this being in the moment thing, it's not actually what went through my mind when I was in that space. I didn't think, oh, wow, I'm really in the moment. It occurred to me afterwards that being the case when I read about being in the moment, like be here
Yeah.
now kind of things. So the
Mhm.
meditation books were saying, like, yeah, I had to say I was a bit disappointed when I got a meditation book, because I was expecting something deep and esoteric about the inner nature of my consciousness and which button you push to light up the world again. And it was really about just sitting and watching your breath. And to me, it felt like, even as an 18-year-old who didn't know anything about this, it intuitively felt like the cart was being put before the horse. So it felt that the being in the moment was a consequence of a deeper cause and not the cause itself. Okay. So something had happened within me, and I didn't know what it was. And it felt something like, for some reason, my anxiety had fell away, but I didn't know why and
Mhm.
what had caused that. And that had allowed me to enjoy the greenness of the grass. But
Mhm.
the mindfulness books are just saying, put your attention on the greenness of the grass. And well, yeah, but I've still got all this anxiety. I mean, that doesn't work, you know, it's just plastering over it. So I was kind of stuck. And I did try and do some more introspective meditation somewhat intuitively, but I'd usually end up falling asleep. So that didn't work. And really, about a year went by of me being maybe a bit doing this because I didn't know what else to do, but being very cynical. And then I read Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now.
Yeah.
And that was the first time I read an account of Eckhart having this, wanting to kill himself, and then having this awakening and going and sitting in a park bench and just finding the world full of wonder and majesty. And it was the first time I think I said out loud, I was reading it in bed, yes, that is what happened to me.
Yeah.
And that's an amazing moment, right? Of finally finding an account you can sort of rely on, or feel you can relate to. But
Mhm.
then, like, I dropped my cynicism to a degree and adopted Eckhart's practices of bringing your mind into the now continuously. And like, I'm not sort of wanting to blame him and his writing for this, but I would say the book overall had quite a negative effect on me over the course of the next. Actually, at most, it could have been 2 years, right? It feels like this really long, intense period of life, but at most, it could have been 2 years where I traded all my problems in life for this, like, one big problem of being in the now, because I was convinced that if I did that for long enough, something in my mind would go snap and I'd be catapulted back into this wonderful place and
Right.
catapulted there permanently. So my
Mhm.
life became this very arduous mindfulness meditation exercise where I had a job in a mailroom at the time, and it seemed to me like folding pieces of paper and putting them in envelopes was really good mindfulness exercise. And then I'd meditate morning, noon, and night for increasingly long periods of time. But on a Friday, I'd often go out after work for a drink, intending to have one or two and get really drunk. And maybe it's the time of life that you do that anyway. But I think there was something in all the strenuous kind of effort I've been putting in to put my mind always on the external world that went snap at that point, and it needed to kind of rebalance itself. And it was like grasping for a release from that in some ways. So a couple of years went by, and I can very much relate to your other guests, particularly. I'm going to forget, is it Mia or Maya, the lady who
Maya.
talked also about having this, like, yeah, really wonderful experience and then doing stuff that got her further and further from it. And
Mhm.
I think you've got to have a sense that of having a time limit on how long you'll do anything for before you have a reconsideration of whether it's really working. Okay. Um, and I noticed that after 2 years, I seemed to be worse, right, in every way. Like, I was more disconnected from life than
Mhm.
when I'd started. I felt like I was living life behind a glass screen. I was having a kind of depersonalization thing going on. I was finding it very hard to interact in conversations with people with any sort of spontaneity. And I'd noticed people around me who were these uh, beautiful, gracious human beings who had never done any kind of mindfulness or meditation, but seemed to be just naturally more in touch with life than I was by a considerable way at this point. And for what, I mean, this doesn't seem fair. You know, what are they doing? You know, so it the whole ideology, and this is sort of a period of my life where I don't have such fond memories of. It wasn't. I wouldn't want to exaggerate how I was doing nice things in life, but inwardly, it's a period that I don't have sort of a happy recollection of,
Yeah.
because yeah, there was this sense of like life will only be good after I get this thing, right?
Right.
And that went on until it started to fracture up in my mind, and over, I suppose, a relatively quick period, um, and then a longer period of about a year, the whole thing broke apart.
Mhm.
So again, I'll pause there, Jessica, and maybe I'll tell you how I came out of that depersonalization in a minute.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's so fascinating how many people's sort of journeys start with the power of now and
Yeah,
double-edged sword aspect of the power of now. Um, and so, yeah, it's been fascinating to hear that that was a pivotal sort of starting point for you. Yeah, I think we can continue.
So my journey is it's like an archetypal pattern, right, of seeing heaven and thinking, that's amazing. I want to get out of this terrible samsara, earthy, mundane place, and going on this quest to get there and making it more and more arduous. And then in some ways, life did, I think, start to improve for me. And I had these experiences like of sitting in meditation and feeling kind of anger in my solar plexus rising up and feeling like bad about that and thinking like, oh man, no, I'm trying to get this enlightenment thing and I can't even get over having anger. And then
Yeah.
suddenly the thought arose, but what is that anger? Right. And oh yeah, I never really looked at it. I'm trying to like grab things in my body and throw them out so I never feel them again.
Yep.
But I've never actually looked at what they are. Maybe I should just take a break from trying to get enlightened for 5 minutes and actually take a look at this. And then I just felt into the feeling. Oh, it's, yeah, really interesting actually. You could learn a lot about yourself by meditating on your anger. Who knew? So it started to crack apart for me, and I started to realize there were big contradictions in what I was doing. So I was like trying very hard to get to where I was by always striving to be somewhere I wasn't. And those contradictions built and built within me. And then somebody gave me Tony Parsons' book
Mhm.
as it is, right? And I know Tony Parsons, for a lot of people who have bad experiences with non-duality, is a bit of a boogeyman, and I can
Yeah.
see why. Okay, I can see why a lot of his kind of no self-teaching could have a harmful effect. But I didn't read him in that way. I read him as someone who is deconstructing a lot of spirituality, and he
Right.
would say things like, you know, you could be sat tapping on your keyboard, dreaming about a holiday you're going to take next year, and then the thought might arise, oh, I need to be concentrating on my fingers touching the keys because I'm doing a mindfulness exercise. But how is one more mindful than the other? You're just rejecting like a part of your experience, this dreamy vision, in favor of another part of your experience. And why are you making that judgment? And I'm actually strongly paraphrasing him there because it's been years since I read him. But or he would say like you could be drinking a cup of coffee and you think I should go meditate, but why is it more meditative than just drinking the coffee? And that really hit me. And it's like, yeah, that's where my thoughts are going anyway. But there's a blinding contradiction in what I'm doing, an absolutely blinding contradiction, and I'm always preferencing this imagined future state and ignoring what is to get to what is. So the whole edifice started to fall apart from me, and at that point, I started to get a lot happier because I was just like enjoying life and enjoying sunsets and weirdly going a little bit closer again to that place I'd been in the garden when I was 16. And it was around that time I went to see Tim Freak, mostly because he did interesting, you know, I was young and interested in different subjects. And maybe Tim's Gnostic stuff appealed to me because it was like this Eastern spirituality. And Tim was talking about Eastern spirituality arising in Christianity. And that was interesting. And I think I picked up something of his energy as a writer, that he was quite a happy, kind of upbeat guy, right,
Yeah.
doing mysticism. He wasn't
Mhm.
dour, right? And that maybe
Right.
intuitively appealed.
Yeah.
Right. And that was 2004. And that was just before Tim had really written out his philosophy about why all the problems of Eastern spirituality. So I came away from that feeling really good, but not with a great philosophical change. And then there was a particular moment where the whole edifice of chasing enlightenment fell apart from me. And I'll just describe that for you, where I went away for a weekend with friends in Ireland. It was September, lovely weather, just a really fantastic weekend, having a great time in the countryside. And I felt really connected to life, really kind of felt like I was close to that place I'd been before. And although a lot of my intellectual constructs around it had fallen away, I still believed that it was possible for my mind to let go and I'd be back in that enlightenment place. And maybe I'd live there forever then. And I felt like, wow, it feels really close. Yeah, and it was crazy when I think about these ideas now. But if you get into a certain mindset, I think people listening to this can understand why they're so compelling. And
Yeah.
then that didn't happen, strangely. And I came home again and went back to like working outside in the rain in this kind of tough, miserable job. And you know, oh well, I missed my chance. Maybe next time. And I was sat at the my computer, kind of reflecting on how good the weekend had been, how nice it was to have developed these friendships and relationships, and how good life had become. Because I was really kind of happy at this place at this time now. And then I was just looking at this piece of Christian art of Jesus, right? And incredibly compelling, kind of what I would have seen in a Gnostic sense as an embodiment of consciousness. And
Mhm.
this thought arose in my mind, summing up all my positive experiences at that time and thinking, you know what, if life is this good, do I even really need enlightenment? And then I was sat right where I'm sat now, Jessica, the same desk, and I like fell on the floor. I literally fell on the floor, and because it hit me like, oh, I won't swear on your podcast, but you know, you know the word I'm going to say, right? That because that I've been chasing an illusion for like 3 years, and all this experience I had could be summed up roughly as like coming into an appreciation of the beauty and the mystery and the majesty of the world. And that's all I ever needed to do to see it. And there was no special state to get it, you know? And I just completely dropped the whole enlightenment thing then. And I would say like particularly from that kind of time period onwards, with big bumps on the road, life has been good. And everything that's happened since then, I've seen more as like a challenge, a very difficult and dark challenge sometimes, but not as like something that's really miserable, like the sort of depersonalization of questing for enlightenment through mindfulness. So that was kind of like the start of like a good life for me then.
Yeah, I love that you're like, that's where I've gotten to as well, is really that what it comes down to for me, if we're going to say, you know, what spirituality is to me, it's what's so central to that is the wonder and the awe and appreciation of the mystery as often as possible, to be in touch with that. And that doesn't have to come along with actually anything else. But it's also good that you mentioned the chasing enlightenment, because we talk about a lot of different ways that people can get harmed by spiritual seeking. And one of those things is definitely, you know, that kind of obsession with having to have some sort of ultimate realization that puts you into some permanent state of enlightenment, that ultimate kind of achievement, although it can often be talked about as like a non-achievement. But so yeah, yeah, I'll also ask you, I don't know if you're planning to go back to this at all, but you had mentioned at one point that looking back at Tony Parsons, that you felt like he was kind of doing away with the spiritual traditions, but at the same time he was also putting forth his own ideology. And we don't have to go into that now, or maybe it'll come back later.
No, well, I can use that as a jumping off point.
Cool.
If you want. So that's somewhat from what people have told me, that they were having these bad experiences. Because you would agree with that, right? That you've met people who've had bad experiences from Tony Parsons'
I would
work.
say he's kind of what a lot of people would see as sort of like the leader of radical non-duality. And absolutely, yeah, I would say he's cited in a lot of the messages that I get from people that have been really harmed by modern non-duality. But also interesting to note that a lot of the non-dual kind of pop-up teachers that we're seeing, especially a younger generation, are highly influenced by Tony Parsons. So there's a lot of Tony Parsons emulators, and I think that's something that a lot of people are noticing, like, oh, another Tony Parsons, just with a different face. So yeah.
Yes, when I heard that people are having like really bad experiences, oh, okay, why is that? Because to me, you helped me deconstruct a load of fantasies, and then I had to go back and I actually told a lie about not reading it in years. I forgot I read this book a few weeks ago for this reason, because of our dialogue. I read chunks of it, so I had to go back and see how people were like seeing it in a way that was different to me, and I think I had some insight into that. Sort of two problems that have arisen for me, I suppose, that we could talk about. One is this thing like that you've just called seeker's syndrome, which is really what I've described so far. And I suppose that leading into the effect of the other problem, which is kind of depersonalization and getting stuck in a certain place. So what I experienced, I suppose, is in some ways however well-intentioned spiritual teachers are in efforts to communicate, what they say is heard as a kind of progressive goal. Okay. So even saying something like, let go whatever is troubling you and just be here now. Be here now is received as, okay, I got to be here now. So I got to like stop worrying about my troubles and continuously focus on being in the present moment. And maybe that wasn't what was intended. Maybe it was, but it becomes destructive. It becomes a way of cutting you off from the beauty and the mystery and the joy of life, in a sense. So one of the things that I've lent more into from dialoguing with you, because like the great advantage of this for me is like the kind of challenging questions you ask that make me really reflect on what I'm doing and why, is when I do meditative stuff with people, I find that they bring, so if they've done meditation before, they bring so much conceptual baggage into it that
Mhm.
whatever I say, they hear a different thing. So
Mhm.
I started going as far as saying, look, okay, I'm not a meditation teacher. I'm not going to do meditation. I don't even like meditation. So forget about that. However, I do sit and introspect on my own consciousness, maybe even sometimes with my legs crossed. So I guess you could call that meditation, but let's not. Let's forget about meditation. We're not going to do that now because I have to break away from this conceptual baggage, okay? And then say, like, but let's just see what it is to breathe. Let's just see, is there any beauty in breathing? Is there a kind of mystery to it? Is there a mystery and a wonder to the nature we're seeing? What about the question of like, isn't it incredible that this exists? Like something exists rather than nothing. Is that incredible? Do you find a sense of wonder in that? And then I'm not saying this is going to happen all the time, but what might arise in that is a sense of like people having that sense of, yeah, that we exist and we're conscious of it. It's incredible. And or using an analogy like, have you ever like lay with a lover and listen to their breath? Or it could be, I mean, your dog or your child or something, right? But I'm being totally captivated by the breath of another being and the recognition that that's their life force flowing in and out of their body. Well, can you get any sense of that yourself? So approaching meditation not as an arduous exercise, but as an awakening of wonder. We could go outside, you and I, Jessica, and find like a beautiful tree. But if I told you, okay, you've got to like sit there and look at the bark, and every time your mind wanders, you've got to return your mind to the bark and keep going with that. And does that make the tree more beautiful to you? Does it, or does it actually make it now an ugly thing because I've reduced it to an exercise? So I find trees, like I really feel blessed to live like all my life in an area where there are lots of trees and I'm driving around. And I still get kind of overwhelmed, right, at these cathedrals of life that have risen out of nothing from the ground and they haven't left a big hole in the ground that it comes from. So I don't even understand that, like how these things can even exist, right? And the solidness of the bark and the greenery and everything. It's just like, there's just an awe and a wonder to them. And there's loads of them. It's just, and the fact that there's one of them is incredible. But meditation can destroy that. Mindfulness can absolutely destroy that sense of wonder by making it into an arduous exercise. So in that sense, it pulls in the opposite direction.
Hmm. So yeah, I mean, there's so much, we've been talking about this quite a bit lately. I mean, it sounds like what you're describing, which is what I've been wanting to actually kind of do, is making meditation, like freeing meditation from ideology, where what you're doing is, because I mean, it sounds like you're saying more that the way that meditation is often framed, or certain types of meditation you see as problematic or not helpful, but that meditation itself, or some type of specific type of attention exercise, um, can bring you into these appreciations for wonder and awe and what I think. Yeah. And then I'm thinking,
Yeah.
and we talk about this too, that I do see benefits in mindfulness. I remember the first time that I was doing a guided meditation was on this like retreat thing in nature. And I remember we were walking along a path, and when they told us this is going to be like a meditation walk, and to notice, the moment that your feet touch the ground, and notice the colors of the leaves, and that prompting to be more aware of details that you're not usually aware of, really did open up this space of, I guess, just sort of noticing things that I wouldn't typically notice. It brought me into a more kind of vivid perception of things. But we talked about, what I was saying is that I think mindfulness meditation can be helpful in training our attention to be able to have more control over it. But when it's made into this constant thing of, you need to constantly be monitoring where your attention is at this moment, at that moment, in this moment, then I think it turns into something unnatural and
Yes.
actually take you out of the present moment. So yeah, I
I would
appreciate.
agree. So I would say like being encouraged to notice more things in nature is fine. I will put in the caveat that I accept there are ways that I could be wrong about this or limited in my view. So mythologically, you have examples of like hero's journeys, I suppose, that are unnecessary. So Dorothy takes the yellow brick road to the Emerald City to find the Wizard of Oz who can send her home to Kansas. And then at the end, the fairy says, oh, that was all completely unnecessary. You know, all you have to ever do is click your heels together 3 times and you're home. But you would never have believed that when you were in Munchkinland. So, and it's the same as the Buddhists have a kind of prodigal son story where the son returns home to the father. He doesn't recognize him anymore. So the father has to employ this Buddhist concept of skillful means and set him to work on the land as an employee and develop a relationship with him until he can accept that he's the son and doesn't need to be working on the land. So you have this this spiritual kind of concept of the need for meaningless tasks, if you like, because you believe they're meaningful. So you need to do this exercise until the point you don't. So that could be a criticism of my position, just to acknowledge that. But for me, Jessica, the question was always, what was at the core of me suddenly stepping into Wonderland? What was at the core of this opening up into the beauty and awe and wonder of the world? And again, I might not have this, right? I might later have to come back and say, oh, actually, that wasn't quite deep enough. Or even if I say what I think it is, then people might hear it in a different way to what I intend. But to me, the most succinct way I could put it was some kind of realization of just existence is, right? That isn't it amazing that something exists rather than nothing? And I walk around always wanting it to be a particular thing, but just having that profound outpouring of gratitude that this is. And there's no reason why it should be. There's no reason a universe should exist. And there's no reason why a universe should exist that gives rise to consciousness that can appreciate it and that we can share this love and life together and the beauty and the awe and the wonder in it. And like, that's all just so incredible. And I've gone around my life missing that very, very most basic fact that existence is. And stepping into that sense now, like I went for a walk through a park with a philosophy professor who's a friend of mine in Ireland, and we shared this kind of sense because we'd always talked about political philosophy. Actually, he's an anarchist, and then suddenly he talked about his metaphysical interests. And walking through the park, just with this man in his 70s, just going, I mean, just look at it, right? What is it doing here, you know? And it opens up this profound sense of beauty in a powerful way. So for me, that's the core thing that happened to me when I was 16. And if I'd had any sense, that's what I'd have like dropped into and explored more rather than mindfulness meditation.
Yeah. And would you say, you know, because we're saying now, like, you know, the greatest miracle perhaps is that anything exists at all. I never got into Tony Parsons. I didn't go so much into the radical non-duality, though a little bit. I remember a book called, I think it was The Wonder of Being. And it brought me into this place of just like deep appreciation and like more acute awareness of this mystery that we're in beautiful ways. But there was no, the self was not included in what we're appreciating. And so the huge shift for me was that I include my sense of self, the fact that we can think, you know, the fact that we can be having conversations and exchanging ideas is part of the miracle. So yeah, I guess I was just wondering, how were you able to somehow not be affected by that, or was that not part of Tony Parsons' approach?
No, it was. I mean, I read it and it helped me deconstruct things. And I do think I continued to have problems. It wasn't like, okay, every problem went away. And I had a period of depression flare up a couple of years later, which I would say, having read Tony Parsons, was on balance helpful with, because I could step out. It did open for me this sense of life as being magical. And even if you're depressed, it's still kind of magical. Now, I could definitely see how you could go the other way. With the non-dualists, I think what happens is, like Tony describes a couple of things about his experience of the famous experience he has of walking through the park. His footsteps are going along the path. He's thinking about something spiritual or whatever. And then all of a sudden he realizes each footstep is unique. And then everything kind of changes for him in that moment. And there's an opening to consciousness and the beauty of nature and a kind of what you might think of as an enlightenment experience. And I don't know how that carries on for him or what he'd say about that. But it's a dropping of all his progressive goals. It's a dropping of his want to be spiritual in exchange for how amazing his footsteps are. Okay, now that's all like great, and that's what I read into it. But there's another aspect of Tony then that really emphasizes the dropping away of the self in that. Okay, Now, again, this is another thing that I've heard across a variety of your guests, and particularly in Maya's interview,
Mhm.
it stood out because I thought it was really good the way she critically interrogated herself about did I have that? Because everyone's talking about getting rid of the self, but when I had this blissful, beautiful experience, I don't know, and I think I would have remembered if I'd had that, and I don't remember. And for
Yeah.
me, when I had those initial experiences at 16, I didn't think anything about myself at all. Like it didn't occur to me myself had gone away. And
Mhm.
even on all the kind of infinite love experiences, I would not have come back from that and said, oh, and myself disappeared.
Yeah.
Definitely, as I continued to explore mysticism and non-duality, those no self experiences became part and parcel of it.
Yeah.
But what I think, and what I'm about to say is controversial, and partly I'm being a little controversial, just so I'm not being sort of namby-pamby here. I might as well like throw a good few hard punches and have a proper conversation. Um, so in allowing that there are other valid perspectives on this, I get the aesthetic appeal of the idea that the center of all this is no self, right? Because it's like a giant joke that God is playing on us. And what could be the better joke than we reach out into the world to try and find happiness and meaning here, there, and everywhere. But
Yeah.
actually, those things are located in the last place we'd look. They're located in the thing that is looking for them, in our essential self. And when we look there, it expands into this infinite field of all blissful, all loving, all peaceful awareness. Oh, great. Bravo. That's a beautiful mythic story. And I think there's truth in it. But I think there is an overemphasis on the no self experience in mysticism. Because I know people, well, for me, I had mystical experiences that were profound and did not contain that no self element. I hear that all the time from other people. And I know people who, to go for a walk through nature with them is just a complete experience of beauty, watching the way they interact and the sense of awe and wonder that arises within them. Okay. And at no point do they ever consider their self doesn't exist. And
Yeah.
so, okay, I'm going to make a speculation to some degree that what is going on there is that the core thing, if I'm right, is this sense of mystery and wonder and awe at the universe and awe at creation that arises. And if you look outwards then onto nature, you can just go, whoa, what is this? And the beauty of it and the life force within it and so on. But it might be that if your attention also goes into your own consciousness, you find that this fixed notion, this atomized, hard, concreted notion of being an individual, an isolated individual, also becomes very beautiful and mysterious and opens up. And it's like, whoa, there's like a field of open, spacious awareness here. And if that happens for you, you might be tempted to emphasize that as the root cause and not as a result of a deeper cause that is stepping into mystery. So, what I see in the work of Tony, where it becomes destructive, and with other non-dual teachers, they will latch onto this, and you'll have people coming to them, often who have had mystical experiences and want to return there, and they will say, well, you just drop into this witnessing awareness and you realize you are the witnessing awareness, or versions of this to get kind of a bit complex and entangled sometimes. But
Yeah.
there's a continuous suggestion that just going there will re-evoke this. Now, maybe it does, but it, maybe it did it a little bit for me, and it's certainly in and of itself an interesting experience. But I didn't have the experience of dropping into this witnessing awareness, evoked any sort of great sense of awe or wonder. And it's not what I see in the non-dual satsangs. What I see is people standing up saying, I've been doing this for 20 years and I feel I've got basically nowhere. And the non-dual teacher will say, aha, and that's because you haven't quite dropped into this true self. And you can see the person didn't get anything from it. And you know they're not going to go away and get any insight. And I also, a lot through your work, Jessica, see it damaging people. So to me, it's like that's the great misconception in non-duality, this non-dual spirituality, that people are coming to it looking for something that they're not going to get because it's not really the key that opens that door.
Yeah. And I think like what happens a lot is again where you get that sort of I always come back to this metaphor of like this nectar laced with poison, because you're getting these really profound, astonishing experiences of awe and wonder and well-being, but they're always tying it in with you're not a person and you're nobody, and the sense of somebody or someone has to drop away, and then you get all of that sort of rhetoric around true appreciation and true beauty and true wonder is the absence of the self, whereas
Mm.
that doesn't need to be tied to it at all. But then also like what you're saying, I think that some of these really profound states of awe and wonder can really, let's say, for example, quiet the mind, or our
Yes.
sense of self can kind of become less prominent. Our attention is shifted away from that. And so I think people then pop out of those experiences and go, oh, well, the self, or my sense of self, or my inner commentary, or all of that seem to be gone. So that must be the key. The key must be getting rid of that. And then that gets kind of reinforced with.
That's what I think. Just as with mindfulness, I think it's cart before horse. Now, I totally appreciate that people will disagree with this, and who knows, maybe I'm wrong. I wouldn't be surprised. But I would invite people to consider that um, the loss of the self does not necessarily lead to a sense of awe and wonder, but rather a sense of awe and wonder can open up a curiosity that the self is not what we think it is. And when you go into it that way, through awe and wonder, it might appear that the self is actually something much greater than we casually take it to be, because that's what I sense when I do go into it that way, and not this kind of reductive, oh, the self is this narrow, cold, witnessing awareness, and I now exist behind a glass screen, which is when
Yeah.
you kind of artificially force yourself into it.
Yeah. There was something I was going to say there. Let me see if it comes. Nope, I forgot. So we can go on from there. I don't know if you remember where we were before I sort of went back in
Yeah,
question.
well, I've that sort of sums up that aspect. I mean, do you want me to carry like, so what happens next for me is really encountering that cold hard. So I suppose it is my sort of non-dual problems come up next, right?
Yeah.
If you want me to
Yeah.
go on to them.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's interesting you ask about like the problems with Tony Parsons stuff, because in one sense it was very liberating, but maybe the wider non-dual philosophy was quite imprisoning too. So that's something that I continued to explore, although in the aftermath of dropping the quest for enlightenment, I wasn't really sure why I was doing it now. I was kind of, well, it's what I do, right? I've spent sort of several years at this point investigating consciousness and all the rest. So I continued to meditate through that period. And my meditations became increasingly introspective, like turning attention around and looking at the thing that was looking. And
Mhm.
that became quite brutal. Okay. So when I would look, I did not find the love and awe and wonder. I didn't find this infinite ocean of love that the mystics were talking about, either the Christian mystics or in the West or the Indian mystics in the East. I found this sort of blank sheet, right, that was just coldly witnessing the world, as dead as the eye of a camera, you know? And that started to wear on me because, okay, that happens initially. And you think, well, again, it's a progressive journey. And if I keep looking at this, it'll open up into all this love I've been told about any day now, any day now. And it didn't, right? It went on for a long time. And then I started to question, well, is it true, right? Because it's not, my experience is not that, you know, there's this infinite ocean of love. My experience is that all the love I've received has come from other people.
Yeah.
And something about contemplating this quite deeply set off a period of depression in me,
Mhm.
which lasted about a year and a half. And it was 9 months of kind of like moderate level. And then it, as I recall, it split where I would be kind of manic in some phases and like sat up all night writing and really infused and having quite a good period of life. And then I'd crash and I'd be like, you know, unable to get up and brush my teeth in the morning. I have to drag myself through that. Um, so it was quite an intense kind of circular thing. And if we look at depression as being something that is functional in some way, like it's trying to stop you doing something because you're effectively driving over a cliff, and you know that the like, look at depression from that sort of integrative lens. What I think happened there was my core kind of sense had been cut away. My core sense of like there's value to life, and I'm trying as a young man trying to live my life and do things in the world. And there's something inside of me going, whoa, 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 hold on here. We've got to get the foundations right because the foundations aren't big conscious love. The foundations are like cold, empty bleakness, which I used
Yeah.
to call the not nothing, because in this sense there wasn't even nothing there. I didn't know if I was going to be able to fix it, but in telling this story, right, I found a resolution with it, and it is almost certainly not the resolution that I would advise anyone else to take to this problem today. So I'll describe what I did, and then I'll describe like maybe why it's not the best and how I would think of it differently, if that's okay, Jessica.
Yeah.
So I eventually came across a spiritual teacher, just taking a look through her book. She described going into this deep self and finding this black hole, which is what I sat on the edge of. And again, it was a bit of an Eckhart Tolle moment of going, yeah, this is what happened to me. And she described allowing herself then to dissolve into that and feeling herself immerse into this infinite ocean of love then. And
Mhm.
again, a bit like with Eckhart, I thought, right, that is what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life. This woman's got it, and she's explained it to me, and I know what I've done wrong. I've gone to the edge of this black hole, but I've maintained a separate sense of self there, and I need to dissolve into it. And I sat up into the night doing this meditation until it got quite late, and I thought, well, I suppose I go to bed, but I'm going to be resuming this tomorrow and every day for the rest of my life. Now that kind of that kind of arduous promise is one we don't always keep. And maybe if this has gone on for 5 years, I'd have decided maybe just drop it and go and live or something. But as it happened, I woke up at 4 a.m. when I would always wake up at 4 a.m. for a fit of depression, right? At that time, it would really always hit me very hard at that time. And I woke up and I saw in a kind of waking dream all the people I knew around me, and they all disappeared off into the distance, and they all represented like a little inner supply of love that was coming my direction. And then there was this moment of complete aloneness, which led to then a dissolution, a real sense of like, I'm dying here, falling into that black hole. And the whole nothing of consciousness opened up into an infinite ocean of love. And it felt like the material universe is a veil covering that love. And it's just been whipped off for a minute or so I can see it. And I felt almost apologetic to anyone I'd ever like lent on for a supply of love in my life, any sort of codependency, because like I was this and they were this too. So it really was a kind of like waves in the ocean experience. And I came out of that, went back to sleep, woke up the next day, my depression never came back. So that was good. But going on to why I wouldn't be recommending
Okay, great.
what I did there, and why I've never put anyone through a meditation that has led to that place at all. So when coming out of that experience, I definitely had the metaphysical sense that I guess that Vita Vedanta is basically correct, and we are all like living in the dream mind of an all-loving God, right? Because it just seemed to be that what Ramana Maharshi is saying is just checked out. Okay, like yep, you step back from the body into the psyche, and then consciousness contemplates itself, and it dissolves in, and poof, infinite ocean of love. So this mystical kind of perennial philosophy seemed to be true, right? And I was capable of intellectually doubting it. So, because I kind of wondered, if you have these really deep experiences, are you still capable of intellectually doubting them? Well, yeah, it could be brain chemicals, right? It could just be a coincidence. And maybe I'll read some evolutionary psychology book one day and I'll go, oh, that's why that happened. Oh, it had nothing to do with like infinite oceans of love. It's just like some selective advantage it confers. I don't know, right? But it really made a very strong case in my mind for the reality and certainly functionality of an idealist, consciousness first, all loving God, philosophical and theological position.
Right.
Okay. So the way I went about it is what I wouldn't recommend, because I carried a lot of non-dual baggage into it. So there was a real harshness and a lack of inquisitiveness and a lack of playful curiosity in my approach to doing this. So in the way that, maybe if I went through for at this point, even maybe I was back to appreciating the natural world and not making it into a mindfulness meditation exercise. And I could go for a walk through a forest and love being with the trees and the birds and the blue sky again and think, oh, wow, this is amazing kind of natural world. When I turned my attention around, I did not carry that sense of wonder into it. I carried a real harshness of like, I have to interrogate this. I have to be the witnessing awareness. And then the witnessing awareness has to turn around and witness itself. And it has to stare into its own center until it really sees what it is, right? And the same kind of harshness that I'd had in mindfulness for the external world, I repeated that pattern. And I think in some senses, I was very fortunate, because I don't think that necessarily leads to anything good. And I'm grateful to Brandon, but I would not recommend that kind of harshness. So I'd actually met Tim a few years before this experience, and for some reason, it never occurred to me to go and sort of talk to him about it, right? I mean, it's not that I knew him well. I'd met him once at that point, or to go back to his group, and not really sure why that is. I thought maybe that it was maybe a bit different to the kind of mysticism he was into, but it is strange that I knew this one person who was like a real mysticism teacher, and I didn't feel the need to go and inquire about my own mystically induced depression. But through circuitous reasons that I ended up going back to his group in 2008. And I think I'd always had an intuitive sense that that was kind of home for me, right? That's where I wanted to be at with this stuff. And even though I've been away doing other things for like 4 years, and it was a kind of roundabout reason, but I got sort of pulled into it. And I met some very nice people and all the rest. And then all of a sudden, I realized that the deeper kind of states of consciousness were opening up for me in the meditative circles Tim was doing than would happen at home on my sofa, right? And this big love experience hadn't opened up for me in like a couple of years, and I wasn't craving it. I just sort of knew it's there in the background. I was getting on with
Yeah.
life, but then it did start opening up. Um, like usually in the middle of the night after I would be on one of like Tim's workshops, okay, and that was profound, but also just the level just down from that of having a deeper state of consciousness arising. Actually, in day-to-day life, I was very curious then. Well, I thought I had a grip on this, and obviously I don't understand it quite as well as I think I did because now it's going much deeper for me. So what's that about, and why does it happen in this group but not at home? And I don't believe it's group effect. I think there's something I'm doing that's different, or some way Tim's inducing the exercise that's different.
Yeah.
And about a year later, I really had to think about this for a year. And then I heard Tim being interviewed. It was actually the interview on Consciousness TV he did, if anyone's interested. It was about 2009. And he explained meditation as a kind of dropping back into the sleep state almost, or dropping back into this deep consciousness,
Mhm.
where we would normally lose consciousness because we would go to sleep, but we maintain some awareness on our breath or some external anchor point in order to stay awakened in the world. And that's when it really hit me what was going on and why I was able to go into this deeper place through doing Tim's often eye gazing exercises, because you're stretching your consciousness in two directions. You're looking right out into the depth of another person whilst dropping right back through like Tim's guidance into the depth of yourself. And that's what would cause these mystical experiences to arise. But what's interesting to me for that is I reflect back and I think, well, had I chosen a different path and not read Brandon's book and just started going back to Tim's thing, I think probably I would have come out of the depression through another way, right? I think Tim, as a teacher and a guide of this, has this very soft, playful, curious, inquisitive manner about consciousness, which is exactly how I wasn't approaching it. So when I would drop my attention in and look, okay, what is this mysterious thing called consciousness? And let's just go a little deeper and a little deeper and dissolve into it in this more playful manner. And that kind of led me to the same place, but in a much kind of softer, nicer, more accessible way. So even if that kind of big lob experience doesn't open up, and oftentimes it wouldn't, and go long times in between, the experience of the depth of and the richness of consciousness that opened up and the beauty of that consciousness sort of mirrored the beauty I found in the external world. And that did lead to a permanent kind of shifting of my sense of self, which still exists on a spectrum, right, where I can come more into it and more out of it. But the
Mhm.
spectrum itself has moved considerably. And I can know that because I can contrast myself now and over the past 15 years, where there's been a relative consistency of this, with
Yeah.
myself prior to that. Okay, so because you have all this like non-dual spiritual speak, right, where people like are always inferring what other people's consciousness is like, as if you could ever know. But one thing you can do is you can contrast yourself with yourself. So that's, I think, a
Yes.
more accurate way of doing it. And so that's where that led to me, and that was like in 2010, and it deepened to some degree after that. But really, after that, I started to become more interested in the psyche and the applications of this deep state of consciousness
Mhm.
to psychological well-being. So the whole journey into consciousness for me was like 10 years. And I think in some of my small amount of writing on this, I quote T.S. Eliot about the four quartets, about returning to the place from where we started and knowing it for the first time. Because if you recall, like I said, when I started, I tried to investigate these deeper states of consciousness myself and would just fall asleep. It wasn't very effective. And so I
Yeah.
dropped it and went on this whole circuitous journey around the houses for all the good and the bad in that. And there's quite a lot of
Yeah.
bad. But it led me back to actually where I'd started from, my own intuitions of like, yeah, it is in the depths. It is about sinking in and exploring consciousness in this beautiful and playful and inquisitive and enjoyable manner.
Yeah. And you've brought this up a lot where you make a big contrast between the way that, I mean, so much of modern non-duality, the types that we're talking about, make this into, this ultimate realization that you have to have. And when you have it, you're a fully realized person and you're free from suffering forever. But especially that notion of this is a discovery of the ultimate final truth. And that being a big difference than, hey, let's go in and explore our inner experience and see what comes of it. And that seems to be something that you and I have also connected over, which is seeing the ways that there can be kind of a blind spot in terms of coming away from some of these experiences with these hardened conclusions, often come from the way that the practices and the pointers are framed. The way that you're describing that playfulness also seems to be tied to kind of like an open-endedness of, this is your exploration, this is your journey. And it's just sort of pointing you towards maybe a part of your experience to explore more deeply without telling you the one way that you can interpret what it means. So that's one thing. And the other thing I wanted to just mention was, because Tim will talk a lot about, and we also recognize that Tim's views and the exercises that he points people to are pretty different today than they were then. But he always says that he thinks the reason why he at least didn't notice any, besides I think one person that had a breakdown and another woman that had some adverse reaction, that for the most part he didn't see people having any hugely harmful responses to those types of experiences. But he always says that he thinks it's because he emphasized the individual, that he never was tearing down the individual or saying that these experiences had something to do with negating individuality, that he always would emphasize and encourage not to turn away from individuality. So I'm curious if that's something that was important for you too.
Yeah, I can speak to that because I was there for a good chunk of it. So just on your first point, Jessica, and I suppose what we're broadly discussing here is it the territory or is it the map? And whether there are inherent problems with the territory, whether
or both.
Yeah. So, but I mean, even if the territory is difficult, what we can definitely say is there are a lot of really bad maps, you know? So, I think you can perhaps take it. I think okay, if you look, knowledge doesn't change necessarily, depending on whether it's internal or external. So the kind of methods that you might employ functionally to acquire knowledge about the external world are probably going to work well for the internal world too. And if you look at, say, the rise of science in the West, you can have this almost archetypal image. Obviously, like Einstein is often seen as this representative of this, whether it's historically accurate or not, of this playful, imaginative curiosity, this open-mindedness. And we love these kind of quotes from figures like Einstein about who will say things like, in his life, he considered he was able to walk into this vast library, which stretched off as far as the eye could see in all directions. And he picked up a couple of books and looked at just a few pages, and that's all he could do. Knowledge is like the grains of sand on a beach. And you can contrast that with scientists who think they're discovering the final truth about everything and think that it's now all fixed and in place and it's all done. And I would actually say someone like Richard Dawkins is a kind of archetype of this. I don't know if you know who he is, being American, but this, and it leads to a harshness and an arrogance. And you find these two archetypes arising in science. Well, if you go over to the mystical world and you find like a book which was culturally kind of popular where I was in the years prior to like reconnecting of Tim, it really sums it up, like Ramesh Balsakar's The Final Truth. Okay. Like if you had a science book and it was called The Final Truth, or a book on art or anything, any field of human endeavor, you would go, okay, this guy's like, whether he has any ability in his field or not is one thing, okay, but he's clearly nuts. It's clearly like completely consumed by a very limited view. Because contrast that to people who do brilliant things. And there is this problem in mysticism that you don't actually have to do anything. You don't have to produce a scientific theory that can make a satellite stay in the sky, or you don't have to play a beautiful piece of music. You can just declare what your inner state of consciousness is. And as long as your wife doesn't come out and contradict you, then you're not going to get in trouble for it. Okay. And who knows whether it's true? Like, this is why I don't like listening to non-duality people, because they don't do anything, right? They never have to put anything on the line. And I don't know what they're like in their personal lives, right? But I know a lot of people lie about what they're like in their personal lives. So it's completely, their insights are basically valueless to me. okay, you can try them out a little bit and see if you're fit, but why would you spend like years of your life investing in someone who could be, you have no way to know whether they're scamming you? Like if you go to an art teacher and they can paint a good painting, maybe they're worth listening to, okay? But what the hell is a non-duality teacher painting? You know, it's a manufactured performance on stage. So that's absolutely how I would think about it, that culturally we need to get rid of this kind of harshness and really think about how we think about exploring these inner states of consciousness, and maybe taking a few lessons from people who you would admire in other areas. So I'll just pause there for a second, Jessica, so then we'll go on, and I can mention about what I saw in terms of map and territory and safety at Tim's thing, and in terms of my own experience of doing that.
What's so unique here when we say, you know, you could be getting scammed by somebody, is it sets up this whole kind of, the truth that I'm sharing with you is another order of truth, and it's a truth that can't be falsified by the mind. It's something that you have to experience, and once you experience it, you'll know it's true, and then you're pointed to have this experience, which for me is a certain way of perceiving reality. It's a certain type of experience that you're being pointed to, that's a real way of perceiving reality. But the moment that you have that experience that matches what they're describing, then it's, aha, it's the truth. And I think you and I talked about that, how that there's something, there's kind of a blind spot there in terms of having been set up to have a specific experience, but also having been fed this kind of dogmatic conclusion from the beginning that's the only one that can be accepted. So if you were to have the same experience and come away with a different conclusion, you'd be wrong and you wouldn't have realized the truth, because that's not, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's tempting for me to go there. I could say about like the big love experiences I had, that you know, it felt like I was immersed in something that was bigger than the universe. Okay, so there's could be a temptation to come back and say, aha, I actually have had the absolute truth. How about that, right? But I think people that generally make truth claims are displaying an inability to see how they could be wrong, more than more than really any kind of making any compelling case for actually having the absolute truth. And the other thing I'd say about it is, when have you ever known anyone who made a claim to have the absolute truth about anything in any area to be more functional for making that claim? When has it ever not made someone dogmatic and an awful person to listen to and be around? So I don't think, like, even if they're right, maybe you should just interject even some false humility. Just pretend to be humble, right? Because you're probably not going to be a better, more functional person for believing that you have the absolute truth about anything.
Totally. Oh, there goes my thought again. There's something about, oh, I was going to say that just, it's fascinating to me that I've gotten to this point where I'm actually less, well, maybe it's not surprising to say, but that I'm less trusting and very turned off by anyone or any paradigm or set of teachings that makes claims about ultimate truth. And it just seems to be like, what seems so glaring to me now is like this obsession with knowing this ultimate unfalsifiable truth that, to me, yeah, there's the dogma of it, there is an authoritarian aspect, but there's that lack of open-mindedness, like you said, that maybe something else can, or maybe that there's these experiences are real, maybe there's a different interpretation, that so many people are seeking, of course, and it's understandable, people want the truth. I wanted that. We don't want uncertainty, but there's something we really lose, even if we're going to go with the playfulness theme about playfully exploring reality and being open to the evolution of your relationship with spirituality and the nature of reality, that gets lost when you think that you've discovered the final truth. So
in any other field of human endeavor, like someone who claims to have found the truth about something and cannot take any kind of criticism of their position, it's a sign of like a fragile ego. You could tell me that non-duality is the one area of human endeavor where that does not apply, and all the people who have what seems like certainty addiction are actually very healthy in their minds. But I don't believe that. It just seems to me that what's playing out is the same psychological patterns around truth claims in every other field of human endeavor. That seems to be the more sort of parsimonious explanation for it.
Yeah, and I also do want to interject and say that I don't want this to come across as like disparaging anybody who's within one of these paradigms. Like, you know, I was there for sure, and it's really human. But I think there were so many blind spots there that are really, you know,
let me
worth
say that maybe they're right. Okay, I can see the compelling
levels of it, but all
Sure.
I would put to them is like, well, what effect is it having on you? You know, this idea that you have absolute truth. Are your human relations going better? Are you a better communicator of ideas? Are you more human and compassionate because you believe you have the absolute truth? Or does it take you away from that? That just like people can answer that question for themselves.
Yeah. Yep. I'm with you. And yeah, you were going to go into the Tims when I was talking about like emphasizing the individual.
Yeah, so my attraction to Tim's work, a big part of it was it seemed to solve a lot of the problems I'd had in terms of the harshness of first mindfulness and then the harshness of self-inquiry by taking a more playful approach, and also by getting rid of toxic concepts like the eradication of the individual. So um, I probably did at least skirt upon the edges and maybe dip a bit deeper into this idea of mindfulness as something that eradicates, or no, sorry, not mindfulness, non-duality as something that eradicates your individuality. And I remember coming across these sentiments of the mystic being someone who neither laughs nor cries because they don't experience this range of emotions, and finding that quite a depressing vision and quite divorced from what I'd experienced when I was 16, and not necessarily looking forward to a life of a limited emotional spectrum. And then coming out of that, and even when I was depressed, Jessica, there was a kind of happiness in that, that I could be depressed, that I could feel so much. And even though it was bad compared to what I thought maybe life would be like under the spell of mysticism, it was good, if you see what I mean. Because then I could also have an extremely positive emotional range. And it's far better to have a range than it is to just be utterly middling all the time. So
Sure.
Tim like restored, I suppose, the dignity of the individual
Yeah.
in mysticism. And I would absolutely agree that that's a huge reason why, hand on heart, we didn't see problems. The other aspect of it was people were never pushed. Like there was the sense that like you're far better coming back and doing this again another time than you are pushing yourself, and not just because it would be good for Tim's pockets, but because that's the best way. So there were people who didn't join in the kind of like larger kind of group meditation on the Saturday night because they felt like, oh, maybe I've done enough now, right? And good for them, you know. So the idea that which I internalized, that having a boundary is as important as being willing to push yourself. And you're probably the best person to judge that, and just have a feel into yourself. And you're not going to get a medal for pushing yourself too hard and for this ultimately being a negative experience for you. Now, this does leave open the question, Jessica, is like, no matter how good you make your map, there's always going to be a problem in it somewhere. And the territory of navigating these deep aspects of consciousness and all this, that might just be difficult territory. And depending what your life has been like, if you've had a traumatic life, then it is going to be difficult territory. And there can be ultimately no way around that, which is where I think we arrive at the value of your work, and where you ask me very pointed questions about what I do, which with some reluctance, I must say, I have to admit, okay, yeah, maybe I am a little bit flippant there. Maybe I do, because of my own experience ultimately being good. Maybe I'm not quite cautious enough about the kind of states I would take people into without knowing not without knowing who they are, but maybe I don't have quite the requisite caution. And I'm not saying I don't, right? But this is what the value of your work is, to make someone like me reflect on that.
Yeah. It's great to hear that. There was something that I wanted to go back to because that's really important, which is being in a community, in a spiritual community or environment where people are not judged and pressured and sort of bullied into doing things that they're hesitant to do or don't feel comfortable doing. And they're sort of, it's turned into, that's your ego that's trying to stop you from getting out of the way, or that's your ego that doesn't want to die. And, that you need to ignore what it's saying and, jump off the ledge or whatever it is. And this I found to be one of the up there on the kind of range of some of the most toxic elements that I see in among a lot of the popular teachers, events that you go to, in the ways that people are spoken to, that it's always kind of like, don't listen to the voice in your head that's, that, or any boundaries that are coming up, that all that stuff is, the ego prison and that kind of thing. And so it's really good to hear you say that
Well,
and share that's not the way that, that it.
yeah, so I'd like to comment on that, actually. So something that I would say very definitely about Tim's events, and something that I've always tried to replicate, is that I would say that 99.9% of people came out of the weekend having had, at the very least, a good time. Okay.
Yeah.
And you might have people who had the best weekend. Like you would hear a lot of people reflect that it was one of the best experiences of their lives. You would have people like myself who really deepened their understanding of mystical states of consciousness. But even the guy who got dragged along by his wife because it was her birthday and this is what she wanted to do, and it was the last thing he wanted to do, even he had a nice time. Okay.
Yeah.
And that was really important to me, that because I think you can set, well, I think I'm very aware that you can set these things up differently, and you can have these big ego dissolving, it's just your ego, don't worry about it, keep pushing on things. And what you might get out of that is maybe a small number of people in the room have a profound experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
And where they do dissolve into big love. But most people will have no experience, because if you set the pace too fast, it's not that they will have any sort of problems. They'll be lost. What the heck is going on? And some people could have a really devastatingly bad experience. And
Right.
even the people that have the profound experience, that's nice, but it's not set you up for a happy life, a happy life, or a success in the future, right? Because you don't have a boundary, and you're still letting someone else push you into this deep state in a way that doesn't feel right to you, or letting you push into, it could be something else, like in a therapeutic setting. It could be revealing too much in a group, or looking into your psyche too much. And if you don't have a boundary of that, maybe it works this time, but the next time you could go splat.
I'm just thinking of like the contrast of like, imagine in any of the groups that you're leading, or in Tim's group back then, that what was being taught was like, if you want freedom bad enough, or if you want this bad enough, then you'll be willing to throw all your caution to the wind and jump off the ledge now, or it'll be sort of like, if you're suffering badly enough, you'll, make the ultimate sacrifice. And so much of that sort of, like you were saying, oh, there's no medals for pushing yourself. However, sadly, in a lot of those non-dual communities and teachings, it's presented as if there is a medal for that, the ones that are not faint of heart and all that. Like, it really sets up this whole sort of, again, like that pressure to kind of be the spiritual warrior, and the one who was willing to, fall on their own sword. And that's something I fell into quite a bit too. That was like, if I want to know this badly enough, or, prove to myself how bad I want to be free from suffering, and to, ignore the voices in my head. There weren't voices in my head telling me that I didn't want to do it. I was totally on board with it.
And I suspect, if I look at myself and my own harshness, that it was me that was sort of pushing me to be harsher. And then I suppose reading books that complemented that. I think there's a kind of self-loathing underneath it, a kind of dislike of oneself, and I want to punish oneself, and, like boot camp style. Okay, but I suppose there's like fitness programs like in the military or something, which are very harsh. But if you go to the gym and your fitness instructor like overloads the bar or something on your first day, you don't end up strong, you end up with broken ribs. Are you just going to tear your muscles? And I think these kind of analogies to something more physical and concrete kind of work, right? Because it's only a really bad fitness instructor that pushes their student too hard and damages them, and they don't make progress overall. And I think it's the same in the psychological world, and I think it's the same in the non-dual spirituality world. If like people who don't really know what they're doing employ harshness, and that they replicate, that they make up for a lack of skill and a lack of human empathy through pushing hard.
Yeah, I think you're completely right on that. So I should have mentioned this earlier. I have a bit of a hard stop on the hour. So we've got like 8 minutes or so. We can always, if we want to keep going, we can always do a follow-up and add more to it.
I'm sure I'd love to do more, but I actually think this is quite a good place.
Cool.
Jessica, I think it's quite
nice. Well, is there any particular way that you feel compelled for us to wrap it up?
No, I'll just say thank you very much for, I don't know if I've ever done such an extensive biographical interview before, so thank you for the opportunity for me to talk about myself for an hour and a half. It'd be great. Yeah.
Honored, and I appreciate very much your nuances. And there's things that we disagree on, but we have quite a lot of common ground that we've discovered and that we're continuing to uncover. And I just really appreciate all of the nuance here, and that fits in quite well with the glorious both and.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. I love your work and what you're doing. It's fantastic to be able to have a nuanced conversation about this stuff, because one of the things that really puts me off from ever talking about it is this, oh, we've arrived at the final truth sense, and there's just, I cannot be bothered, you know. So I really love the way you've opened up a space for nuanced conversation around these topics too.
Well,
and would love to hear from anyone. I know I've probably said some controversial things. I'm not too attached to the positions that I've said, so any, you know, comment section or anything, or if you receive any correspondence, Jessica, would love to hear from people's
absolutely
feedback on this.
I will send them your way.